what we'll be looking through is the access arrangements for candidates with reading difficulties. So I just want to introduce myself first. So I'm Jim, and I work for Scanning Pens. I'm also dyslexic, and I look after the secondary sector for the UK, Ireland and Scotland. So anyone who already has some pens, you probably already know a lot about us. And just if you have any questions for secondary schools, or you require any training or any more information, please feel free to get in touch with me. So I'll leave my email at the end. So it's jim@scanningpens. So what I will do is introduce my next person, which is my colleague Geraldine, who looks after FE and HE, and then I will introduce our main guest. Pass over to Geraldine.
Hi, good morning everyone, and welcome to our webinar this morning. Absolutely delighted to be joined by Caroline Reid this morning, and thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us this morning. So as Jim mentioned, I'm the UK College University Manager with Scanning Pens. I also look after British Independent Schools and British International Schools. So thanks so much for joining us. As Jim mentioned, we will be sending you a copy of this presentation via a recording, and should you have any questions at all, you're interested in learning a little bit more about the technology we can offer, then you can contact us direct. So my email is geraldine@scanningpens.com. Thank you.
Thanks, Geraldine. So just again, massive thank you for everyone who's joined today. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce Caroline Reid. We've done so much work with Communicate Ed, and it's great to have her today on our webinar. So thank you so much, Caroline, for joining us today. Just a quick housekeeping. Anyone who's got any questions, you can type it in the chat box, but could you leave that right to the end? So if you have any questions, we'll read them out and we'll ask Caroline regarding them questions right at the end. So I'm now going to pass over to Caroline, and she'll be going through the presentation for you. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jim and Geraldine. So yes, I'm Caroline Reid. Some of you will recognise me, I'm sure, from our courses. Some of you may know me as Lina, which is what I go by for people who know me. Yeah, probably many of you recognise me as Caroline. So we're looking today at access arrangements for students who have difficulties with reading. So here's your IEP for the session. I hope that by the end of the session, you'll be able to describe the range of access arrangements that are available for candidates who have reading difficulties. Of course, there's lots of other difficulties, writing, processing, etc. But I'm simply going to be focusing on students with reading difficulties today. How to apply for those arrangements and the criteria and evidence that you need for each arrangement. So this will be relevant to assessors who work in schools. I'll tell you a little bit about the evidence that you need. If you're a SENCO or perhaps an access arrangements coordinator, we're hearing again and again that often the SENCO doesn't have time to oversee access arrangements. So the job is given to an access arrangements coordinator. And really, I'm not going into huge depth, so anybody who's just interested in access arrangements or reading, this will be relevant to you. So this is the document that I'm basing my presentation on. You might remember this as the orange book, or if you're very old, the pink book. In fact, this is no longer a printed version. It's just in PDF. You can get it from the JCQ website if you want a copy. If you just type in JCQ regulations to Google, it will come up. If you're actually based in a school and have got access to the access arrangements online portal, so the centre admin portal, you will have access to an interactive version, which means that you can just take out the bits that are relevant to you. So you can hide any sections that aren't relevant to you. So that's a useful interactive document there. And just to reiterate, what I'm talking about today are general qualifications. You can see there on the cover of the booklet a number of the qualifications that are covered. Mainly it's GCSE and A-level, but of course, as you can see there, different awarding bodies do offer different qualifications at the same level. So we're not looking particularly at HE today, although having said that, the JCQ are the people who've thought through access arrangements far more than anybody else. So I do know that very often universities do look at the regulations before they draw up their own requirements. HE, it's left to each university to decide what their requirements are for access arrangements. So I just want to spend a couple of slides giving you a good foundation and understanding of what access arrangements are about. So who are they for? Well, they're for the candidates who've got the required knowledge, understanding and skills, but they're unable to demonstrate those in an assessment because they've got a difficulty or disability. So these are the students who know the science, they know the geography, they know the history, but for some reason they've got difficulty demonstrating that because they've got a difficulty in accessing the assessment. So in the case of a reader, in most subjects, we can read the paper to them, either a human reader or perhaps a computer reader. We'll look at those different things in a moment. So where the focus of the assessment isn't reading, we can read the paper to them so that the student is able to demonstrate the science, the history, the geography, etc. And the aim, of course, is to allow learners who've got special needs, disabilities, and of course injuries, those students who fall out of a tree or off their bike and break their arm so they can't write, we can give them a writer for the exam in order to let them show what they know. It's all about students showing what they know, really. So any help that we give them should be the normal way of working. This is a phrase from the JCQ booklet, the AARA as we refer to it. Any arrangement should reflect the help that's given to the candidate in the centre. So we shouldn't be putting something in place just for the exam. It should be a continuation of the support that they get in the centre. And they're agreed before the assessment. It's not something that you decide on the morning of an exam that actually, yes, we'll give a student a reader. There's a quite long lead up to that, getting permission and making sure that everything's in place. So when we give an arrangement, it mustn't undermine the effectiveness of the qualification in providing a reliable indication of the knowledge, skills and understanding of the candidate. So we must make sure that any arrangement we're giving doesn't undermine the assessment. It's important to the awarding bodies, to government, to schools, to employers that qualifications, a certificate does say something genuine about the student and what they can do. So we've got to be careful to make sure that we're not giving a student marks for something they didn't demonstrate. And an example of that would be in a paper assessing reading. So for example, in the English reading sections of the language papers, we can't give a human reader because the student wouldn't be reading independently. And if we did give them a human reader, we'd be misleading an employer about a student's ability to read. And so assessment requirements mustn't compromise, access arrangements mustn't compromise assessment requirements. That's absolutely key that we grasp that. Another example would be it is possible to have a practical assistant, but there's a huge limit to how much a practical assistant, for example, can do in a practical paper, so in design technology. Of course, that would be nonsense, wouldn't it, if you were assessing a student's ability to do practical tasks and then someone else did it for them. So hopefully that clarifies the importance of the assessment being valid. So here are the main arrangements for reading difficulties. You might think that the only arrangement is a reader, but of course there are lots of nuances on that, which I'm going to cover today. So reader, a human reader. When we say reader, we mean a human reader. A computer reader, extra time for reading, where a student reads slowly. A language modifier, read aloud, the exam reading pen, and also coloured and virtual overlay. Sometimes students can read better if there's not a stark black-white contrast of what they're reading. You can see our slides here are a yellow background, and that often helps students who have reading difficulties. So let's start with the reader and the computer reader, which come under the same heading in the AARA. And I'm going to, as I talk about each arrangement, I'm going to tell you what evidence you need. And in the case of a reader, you do need a short file note, and I'm going to show you an example of that. And in fact, you've got one in your course materials. I think Jim has emailed out to you a set of materials which start with the PowerPoint slides that I'm running through, and then at the end there's some handouts, and I'll tell you about those as we meet them. So there are a few arrangements that Access Arrangements Online, which is what AAO stands for, can approve for up to 26 months. So you make an application through the online system, and you get a permission for 26 months. So if I applied on the 1st of September 2020, I'd get permission through until the 1st of November 2022. And these include a scribe, 25% extra time, a reader and a computer reader. One application now covers both, and also a bilingual dictionary with extra time. Of course, the one that we're really focusing here is on the reader, computer reader. So these are intended for candidates who've got a substantial impairment, including learning difficulty. So it might be a physical disability or a sensory impairment. Perhaps they have a vision impairment and can't read. Or it could be a learning difficulty where they've never really been able to learn to read properly. And of course, as we've said, the use of a reader or a computer reader is the normal and current way of working in the centre. And let me just go off piste a little bit here. You may remember that a couple of years ago, you had to actually have standard scores, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute, to have a reader. You had to have a score below 85, which puts you in the below average range before you could have a reader. And a couple of years ago, they removed that. So you just need the short, concise file note, which I'm going to show you in a moment. So the initial reaction to that was, oh, we don't need to do a reading test anymore. But actually what we're finding is that the schools that we work in, I work with a team of assessors that go into schools and carry out assessment for access arrangements. We're finding that many schools actually still want us to do standardised testing because having a reader is a bit of a hidden arrangement. So if you think about a scribe, the teachers will always have seen whether a student's got terrible spelling or terrible handwriting, or they're really, really slow and they need the help of a scribe, because they'll be marking homework, they'll be marking classwork. Extra time, students will be known to the teacher because they'll notice that they don't get as much done in the time as their peers do. But when it comes to reading, it's a bit of a hidden arrangement. So what I found is that I've had students who've come up with really low scores, and I'm sure they need a reader, but the SENCO or the Access Arrangements Coordinator is saying, no, I don't think they have any reading help. And actually, when we dig a bit deeper, we find that they do. So it could be that in a low ability class, the class teacher, the subject teacher, reads everything to the whole class. Well, that's having reading help. It could be that there's a teaching assistant in the class, maybe even allocated to another student, but this student often puts their hands up and asks for help with reading. Well, that's having reading help. You don't have to have an adult sitting next to you every minute of every day reading to you to have a reader in class. And the other possibility is that we often find these students sit next to their mate who's a pretty good reader and they read to them. So we often have to dig around a bit more to get this evidence of the normal way of working when it comes to readers. So in order to apply for a computer reader or a reader, the SENCO or the equivalent in FE, that's a new phrase this year, recognising that FE colleges often don't have SENCOs and they are actually more likely to have an access arrangements coordinator. They must be satisfied that the candidate has an impairment with a substantial long-term adverse effect, all phrases from the Equality Act, persistent significant reading difficulties, that the candidate's disabled within the meaning of the Equality Act, and there's a genuine need for the arrangement. Now that sounds pretty harsh, doesn't it? They're disabled within the meaning of the Equality Act. Really, the JCQ put that in just to reiterate that this isn't just for anybody who fancies having a reader. The student does genuinely have to have a difficulty. And in order to make an application through Access Arrangements Online, you need evidence in your file for this student. And so the SENCO produces a short, concise file note, which they put on headed paper. They sign and date that. And that confirms the nature of the impairment and shows how having a computer reader or a reader is the current normal way of working. You don't need a Form 8 or assessment evidence anymore. And of course, I mentioned the possibility of a human reader in the class, but the computer reader also, many of our students, actually, if there's a lot of reading, are quite used to using their computer readers in class. And here is handout 1. So if you look at the back of the document that we've given you, behind the PowerPoint slides, you'll find this document We filled in an example and the JCQ has checked this. It's really, just to reiterate, it's just a one-page document, doesn't need an awful lot of work on it. It's quite straightforward, but you do need to have this on file for the JCQ inspector, who will come and check up to make sure you've got the evidence for what you've applied for. So I'm just going to give you a moment now to find that in your course materials and have a quick look through that before we move on. Okay, so let's move on now. Now, up until now, I've been talking about computer reader and reader under the same heading, but do remember that a computer reader allows the candidate to work independently and will be better preparation for FE, HE or the workplace. So really, we want to encourage our students to get onto some kind of technology to help with their reading. And the first one that I'm talking about here is the computer reader. And training, of course, is essential to use a computer reader effectively. But you do have to have permission before the student can use a computer reader. You make the same application. Now, we had a nice little video here of showing you a computer reader, as the JCQ call it, or text-to-speech video, but we haven't been able to work out how to actually play that with the sound. So I'm afraid we're going to have to skip that. So you do get early access to the PDF if you're working with a computer reader. Most awarding bodies send a secure link to the PDF that becomes live 60 minutes before the published start time, and then you can upload that non-interactive PDF for a computer reader. It's non-interactive because you can't type into it. At the moment, the awarding bodies don't provide an interactive document that you can type into. So if you were having a computer reader and also a scribe, you would have to have separate screens, either two separate computers or perhaps jumping between screens, which makes me feel a bit dizzy. But many of the students I work with, they just jump between screens without even thinking about it. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. So remember that in sections of papers testing reading, the human reader can read instructions and rubric. So do 3 of this section and 1 of that section, and they can read back what the candidate's written, but they can't read questions or texts. However, the computer reader can read instructions and rubric and the questions of the text. And that's actually the same for the exam reading pen, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. So that's another reason, quite apart from it being a great life skill to be able to use a computer reader or a reading pen, actually they are allowed to help in an exam, actually in the English exam, which you can't have a human reader because the student isn't working independently. The reader, just a couple of points about what the reader can and can't do. They can't explain or clarify or advise on timing or order. They can read one-to-one, or they could read occasional words within a group, and a student might raise their hand or a card if they need help. Some stats I thought you might be interested in, so about how many readers and computer readers were applied for. This is actually from the exam season in 2019. Of course, there wasn't one in 2020, so we haven't got the stats for that. Usually these stats are put together by Ofqual in December, so I'm not quite sure whether they're planning to do it this year, given that there weren't exams, because people will still have applied for readers and scribes, etc. So over 400,000 individual access arrangements were approved in 2019, and that was an increase on the previous year. And that sounds huge, but remember, that's individual arrangements. So if a student had 2 arrangements, that would have counted as 2 when actually it's only 1 student. So maybe perhaps a bit more than half of that number actual students had arrangements. And that's in the context of over 1.3 million candidates taking exams. And there were just over 95,000 applications approved for a reader. And that's actually 7.2% of the whole cohort. So quite a large number there having readers. So the next arrangement that I mentioned is extra time for reading. The evidence that you need is a Form 8 for learning difficulties or a detailed file note for a student with a substantial impairment. Most likely that's going to be a student with a vision impairment when we're thinking about reading. So I'll show you both of those in a moment. So for a student with learning difficulties, you need an assessment by a level 7 assessor. We're looking for below average standard scores, and I'll explain that a bit more in a moment. Not percentiles or age equivalents, and you need to put the evidence on Form 8. You can't use a diagnostic assessment or spreadsheets or an email. It's got to be on a Form 8 because the JCQ inspectors are familiar with that form and they'll be able to look through it quickly. So Form 8, you can find at this link, or actually if you put JCQ Form 8 into Google, it will come up. And that includes Part 1, which is the background put together by the SENCO. Part 2 is the assessor's report based on standard scores. And then Part 3 is the recommendations, which in this case, of course, would be a reader computer, extra time rather. So who can carry out those assessments? It must be carried out by an assessor with the required level of competence and training. So you're probably aware that assessors must hold a level 7 qualification, and there are a number of qualifications out there. We actually offer the PAPA, Postgraduate Award of Proficiency in Assessment for Access Arrangements, which qualifies you to carry out assessments. So an assessor can't sign assessments carried out by someone else. So you couldn't get a TA or the SENCO who's not qualified to do assessments. You've actually got to do it yourself as a qualified assessor, and that's what you'd put in Part 2 of Form 8. So just to show you here, this is what's often referred to as the bell chart for obvious reasons. And the average range is between a standard score of 85 and 115. So that range there, just under to 70% of the population would fit into that range. And we're looking for extra time, mostly for scores below 85, so in this range here. So in the bottom 15% of the population, so below a standard score of 85. And actually later on I'm going to talk about a language modifier, and actually you need really low scores. You need scores below 70. So in the bottom about 2%, very, very low numbers of students who would qualify for a language modifier. So we're looking for scores on this scale below average, below 85, for a student to have extra time for reading. And here we've given you Form 8, a completed version, so you can get some idea of how much you'd have to write. Again, I'm going to just give you a moment to find that in your course materials, at the back of the course materials, and have a quick look through that. You can see it's quite a wordy form. So just take a moment to look through that. Okay, no time for extra time for reading for the slow readers. If you're interested in Form 8, do have a look at it later. So I mentioned that for extra time, for learning difficulties, you need a Form 8. But if you've got a student with a substantial impairment, and as I said, this is most likely to be a vision impairment, or actually a student with learning difficulties who has an education, health and care plan. So what you have to do in this situation is have a detailed centre file note. So not the short, concise file note that we saw earlier that's needed for a reader, but for extra time you need a detailed centre file note on centre-headed paper. You have to have a hard copy or typed or electronic signature. Any of those will do. And you save that either in hard copy or electronically for that student. Form 8's not required, and in fact you mustn't use it. So it's not the option to go down the assessment route and use Form 8 for a student with a vision impairment, for example, which I think is the most likely reason that you're going to need a reader for a substantial impairment. So just to run through briefly what the detailed file note would say, it confirms that the candidate is or continues to be sorry, let me start again. Confirm that the arrangement continues to be the candidate's normal way of working in the centre. So you're confirming that. Teaching staff confirm that the candidate has persistent significant difficulties and how these impact on teaching and learning. And then that's just those two statements, so quite straightforward. You'll have to involve the teachers in this, but then you back that up with evidence of the student's disability. So that might be from CANS and mental health issues, HCPC registered psychologist, a medical consultant, a psychiatrist, speech and language therapist. That's probably not relevant to readers. That's more likely for a student with writing difficulties or speaking difficulties. The local authority specialist service, so perhaps a teacher of the vision impaired, or a student with a current statement for whatever reason. That would be your backup evidence alongside the detailed file note. So here's an example of the detailed file note. I'm really just making you aware that that's there. You can have a look at that later. That's handout 3. So for a student with learning difficulties, I mentioned Form 8, and on that Form 8, the SENCO has to paint a picture demonstrating the need for extra time, providing compelling, clear and detailed picture of the current need. And they would put that in part 1 of Form 8, as you will have seen as we looked through earlier. So they have to be really clear that extra time is needed. So the core evidence alongside that supplementary evidence that the assessor will be looking for extra time is below average standard scores in assessments relating to speed of working. And most likely, if it's an issue with reading, it will be reading speed. But the student can also have extra time for writing speed or cognitive processing, which could be something like visual processing, phonological processing. It could be working memory. There's a number of tests that sit under that cognitive processing heading. So I just want to reiterate something that's in the AARA about reading speed. There's actually 2 kinds of reading speed, and it's important that we understand this and don't miss one of them. So the first kind is where a student's slow to decode the text. And most assessments measure that by what they call reading speed, reading rate, or reading fluency. So when the student reads the first time, either silently or out loud, they're slow at it. So they perhaps stumble over words, make mistakes, have to go back and read again. But these assessments, all they assess is the time it takes the student to read the first time. But of course, reading the first time doesn't necessarily mean you've taken in what you've read. And I think many assessors make the mistake of thinking that by doing a reading speed test, they've actually they've picked up students who read slowly. But in my experience, and I speak as a dyslexic here whose difficulty is reading comprehension speed, there is this area where a student's slow to understand the text and they need to reread. And that's measured by reading comprehension speed. And we have to do an assessment which actually provides a score for reading comprehension speed. It assesses how long it takes a student to read and understand what they've read. So they might have to read once, twice, 3 times, 4 times even before they've taken in enough to understand what the question is saying. And as you can see, I'm sure that in an exam, that's a real disadvantage, much more so than just reading speed. If you read slowly the first time, but you get it the first time, actually, that's not great, but it's not too bad. But if you have to read the text a number of times before you've understood it, that will slow you down in the exam. And it's important that as assessors and as SENCOs picking up students who work slowly, that we do that. So language modifier, this is a very unusual arrangement, so I'm going to skim through it quite quickly. You need a Form 8 no matter what the student's need is. If they have a vision impairment or they have autistic spectrum disorder, no matter what the difficulty is, even if they've got a statement, you've got to have a Form 8. And there's a number of arrangements that you have to refer to the awarding body. So that's the case with this. You'll apply through Access Arrangements Online, and it's such an extreme arrangement that the system, AAO, can't approve your application. It will give you the option to refer through to a human being at the awarding body who will look at your evidence. And there's a few arrangements that fit into this, up to 50% extra time, more than 50% extra time, practical assistance, language modifier, or if you put other on AAO, if you've got an arrangement that doesn't quite fit into the AARA and you're wanting to introduce maybe something new. So when you want a language modifier, there isn't a box to tick saying language modifier. You click other and then you explain what you want. You want a language modifier. There are a number of other arrangements that would come under that other heading. But the important thing to remember here is that language modifier, you tick the other box to make an application. And as I said, this is for all candidates. They need assessments in part 2 of Form 8, and that's got to be done actually just before the exam, in the 26 months before the exam. That's not the case for 25% extra time. You've got to have a qualified assessor, and we're actually not looking at just below 85 here, as we were, for example, for extra time, up to 25%. We're looking for below 70, so right in the bottom 2% of the population. So a very small number of students. So a language modifier results in a standard score of 69 or less for reading comprehension or vocabulary. And that's in all cases, including students with a hearing impairment. So these are for students who need lots of modification in class, either the students who put their hand up and say, I don't understand, can you help me? Could you explain this to me in the classroom? It's an adjustment of the last resort. You try a human reader, a computer reader, extra time, you try everything else first, and this is the last resort. So you only look at this when everything else has been tried and exhausted. Now, what the language modifier can do is they can reword the carrier language of a question, but only where the student asks for help. You can't change technical or subject-specific language, and you can't change or actually sign. So some language modifiers would be using sign. They can't sign source material, so anything that the examiner didn't write. So if you've got an article, perhaps from a magazine that you're looking at in English language, or a historical source in history, that can't be changed or signed to the student. It could be read, but it can't be changed. Language modifiers, you can't just do it on an hour's training like you could a reader or a scribe. You've got to have actually been accredited as a language modifier. And we at Communicate Ed run an online course which would qualify language modifiers. I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to have a look at this unmodified GCSE paper. Actually, to be fair to the awarding bodies, in our language modifier training, we're finding it harder and harder to find badly worded questions. They're getting much better at getting their wording right. This is quite an old PE GCSE paper, and I'm going to give you literally 2 or 3 minutes, which is what you would have in an exam if you were a language modifier, to have a look through and see if you can pick up 2 or 3 things that are wrong here and that could be improved. So I'm just going to pause the presentation and wait while you have a quick look through that. See if you could improve that at all. Okay, I'm going to have a look and see if you picked up some of those things. Well, that first sentence isn't really needed. It's a bit of extra information for the reader. But you'd have to be careful just taking that out, because sometimes that background information can help the candidate. The trouble with being a poor reader is that often you need more words, so you probably need simpler words to describe something that actually most of us would get in one long word. And that's one of the issues of being a poor reader. You actually have to read more information. So 2 instructions are given in one wordy sentence. Let's have a look back at that. So we've got here, this first sentence about the swimmer is not really necessary. And this section here is a long wordy sentence, and that's always bad for poor readers. Actually, it'd be much better to do a couple of bullet points there. Bullet points with short sentences or short phrases is always easier for a reader to read. The paper, the question uses the passive voice, is used by the swimmer rather than the swimmer used. And some students never actually get the passive voice, particularly students with a hearing impairment. That's a very difficult construction for them to understand. Remember, I said that you can't change subject-specific terms and you can't change command words. So like discuss, evaluate, etc. We can't change those because we could inadvertently be changing the question that the examiner is asking. So here's one that my colleague Derek Heppenstall, who's a very experienced modifier, has come up with. He works with the awarding bodies. Often he actually modifies papers after the committee has put them together, before they actually go out to schools, to make sure that they're as simple as they can be. You can see here that he's decided to take out that first question, that first sentence, which he felt was unnecessary information. We haven't put bullet points, but in effect, that's what these are. Very short sentences, much more easy to understand. And he's changed the voice here from a passive to an active voice, where the swimmer would use each of these components. Derek tells me that when he's modifying, he'll shut himself in a room for at least an hour and modify the paper. And even then, sometimes the examiners come back and say, that wasn't quite what we were asking. So this whole thing of language modification in an exam is fraught with difficulties, where we're expecting people who are qualified but inexperienced to change papers. And we know that there's a lot of poor modification going on, so students are advantaged or disadvantaged. Have I put you off having a language modifier? If so, I've done my job well, and the JCQ will be pleased with me, because it's such a fraught arrangement, with the possibility of giving the student an advantage by telling them too much, or a disadvantage by changing the question. So if you can, stay clear of language modifiers. Then the next arrangement is read aloud. You don't need any evidence apart from that it just must be the normal way of working. The inspector shouldn't ask you for evidence of this. And this is for students who just struggle to read quietly and benefit from reading aloud. Now, this comes into the category of arrangements that are delegated to the centre. So the centre can decide. They don't have to apply to access arrangements online, and in most cases, they don't need any evidence. And there's a number of these arrangements. I won't go through them all, but you can see them on the screen. But read aloud and the exam reading pen fit into this category. So all we need to know is that this is the student's normal way of working. So read aloud is for candidates who benefit from hearing themselves read aloud. Teachers recommend reading aloud, and they have difficulty perhaps with reading accuracy. They might need occasional words and phrases, and they'll be accommodated in another room away from the main exam room. So you wouldn't be reading aloud in the main exam room, you disturb everybody, but you might be out in a room where a number of students having readers or scribes, and there's a general background hum that actually doesn't disturb other students. I get this, actually. I find myself, if I'm reading a difficult passage, an academic passage, I find myself sub-vocalizing, just reading, not very loud, but it just helps me concentrate and focus on the text. Now, under the read aloud regulation, we're now allowed to have a reading pen. So just to look back again, so you might need occasional words or phrases read, and if you come under that, then you can have the exam reading pen. So there's no evidence required, it just must be the normal way of working. The students must use these in class on an everyday basis. So a candidate who normally has a reader, normally would have a human reader in a paper testing reading, can use the reading pen. So they could swap it. Because the student's working independently, they can actually have the reading pen in that language paper that I talked earlier on about how the human reader couldn't work with the student in that exam. But you could have a computer reader, or you could have the exam reading pen. However, if you do that, if you're working without a human reader that you would normally have in the English language paper, you get 50% extra time to read, and you wouldn't be allowed that if you're actually having the exam reading pen or a computer reader. So a reading pen can be used without permission. Just reiterate that this whole group of arrangements we're talking about now, the decision is delegated to the centre. You don't have to apply for permission. It's just got to be the normal way of working. The pen mustn't have a dictionary, thesaurus, or data storage facility. You could use earphones in the main hall so as not to disturb other students. One of the advantages of both the exam reading pen or the computer reader is that the student can get it to read back to them however many times they want. We hear from research that students working with a human reader are often embarrassed to ask for something to be read more than once or twice. But you could ask your computer reader or your reading pen to read the bit that you want read 10 times and no one would know. You'd be the only person who knew. So we know that's one of the big things about actually using technology for this access arrangement. You'll know that that scanning pens have the orange pen. They've got a grey or black pen, which is the reading pen, which has a dictionary, a thesaurus or data storage. But the orange reading pen is the exam reading pen. So that's great because it means that the invigilator will be able to tell whether it genuinely is a paper that can be used in an exam, or whether actually a student has sneaked in something that actually has got a dictionary or thesaurus in it, which is not allowed. So, as I said, it can be used in papers testing reading. The centre must provide the pen, not the parents. And just to reiterate, if you're doing Cambridge IGCSE, the reading pens can be granted by the centre. The CIE took a while to come in with the JCQ on this. They were for a long time asking for standardised score evidence, so below average scores for the student to have a reading pen. They changed that a couple of years ago, but you do still need supporting evidence on file to have a reading pen with the Cambridge IGCSE. And we did have a little video, but sorry, we couldn't play it. I'm sure you've all seen videos of the exam reading pen, or you can certainly access one on the Scanning Pen site. And just really to reiterate that coloured and virtual overlays, either a coloured overlay that the student puts over the paper, or a virtual overlay if they're using a computer reader, that often does help students, particularly with dyslexic type difficulties. And that's fine. Nobody even needs to know about that, really. They might be also using coloured lenses in clear glasses. That's another way of having coloured overlays, is to actually have a pair of glasses, and nobody needs to even know about that. You don't need any evidence. So I've given you a document here, handout 4, in case you wanted to know exactly what you need on file when you make an application. And this covers all different arrangements, all different kinds of difficulties and stages of education. You can see that there's some green there and red. Our coding when we do training generally on access arrangements is that we put in red anything that's a change for the current year, and green anything that changed last year, so that people can quickly and easily update themselves on any changes. So I'm really just making you aware that you've got this in your pack, been checked by the JCQ, and we know that many of our centres do actually use this to refer to in terms of what evidence they need. So I'll let you have a look at that later. I'm aware that we're running out of time and you've got questions. Now, just before we go into questions, I want to make you aware of a couple of resources that we have. So this document here, which you've got, handout 5 in your materials, is just a document. We've got a number of resources we've developed to help make life easier when you're looking at access arrangements. So there's information about tests, there's a way of recording scores, there's guidelines for candidates. So you give your candidate the document and say, you know, you're having a reader, this is how it will work, you're having extra time, this is how it will work. Send that home to parents if you want to. We've actually got materials here for you to train your readers and scribes. Of course, a reader or a scribe can't just tip up in an exam and do it. They need to know exactly what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. So various resources there. Everything that we take for this, in fact, it goes direct through to our charitable trust with Links International. So we don't even get to see the money for this. It all goes straight to our charity. So if you're interested in any of those, do have a look at it. And then also we've given you our latest online training catalogue. We run a lot of training, some of it face-to-face, less face-to-face this year, of course. We've been doing live interactive webinars instead of actually dashing around the country meeting with people. But we've got a number of courses here about access arrangements if you're in FE, or if you're in a secondary school, or if you're in an overseas school. We have training in the AARA, the regulations there, and also information about our qualifications. So I mentioned the PAPA for assessors. We've also got the APAC, which is an Award of Proficiency in Access Arrangements Coordination. So for people who organise access arrangements, that's actually a qualification with an Ofqual registered awarding body. So do have a look at those, and please do come back to us. I also want to mention that we have a membership programme where we keep you up to date with changes, lots of free resources, free assessments, free little videos and things. And that's £15 a year. But if you join for the first year, it's free for the first year, and then £15 a year after that. If you're interested in that, please just email my colleague Debbie on admin@communicateed.org.uk, and she'll send you details of how you can access that first year free. Right, that's it from me for the presentation. So back over to you, Jim, if you've got any questions from colleagues. Very happy to take them.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. I think Jim will be joining us somewhere.
Okay.
I think so far we've just got one question. So if anyone has any questions, do put them down in the chat box. But so far, Jill Ridley is asking, do we need to have a qualification to modify the wording, as I've tried to get on a course and been unable to do so?
Okay, yes. As I said, for a language modifier, you do need a qualification. I'm not quite sure why you haven't been able to get on a course. There's only actually one course that's run, unless you're a qualified teacher of the deaf, but there's only one course that's run, and that's by the CIEA, the Chartered Institute of Educational Assessors. But we work with them to present an online version of that. So if you go onto our website and put in the search button language modifier, or if you email my colleague Debbie at admin@communicateed.org.uk and say you want the language modifier course, she will be here to help you.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Scrolling down. Lynn Dixon's asking, please would you clarify extra time allowance for students who usually has a human reader but have to read the reading section of the GCSE English paper independently?
Right, so
I always get asked this.
Yeah, so what happens is, if you in your application approve notice, when you apply through AAO for permission to have a reader or a computer reader, you get an application approve notice. If you read that carefully, you'll see that if you can't use the human reader, so for example in modern foreign languages reading paper, excuse me, or the English language reading section of the paper, you can't have a human reader, you will be allowed 50% extra time to read that yourself. But if instead of the human reader you use either a reading pen or a computer reader, you can't have that extra time. Hopefully that's clear. Do come back again if not.
Yeah, I think that's okay. Julie Flucker, how much are the exam pens? One for you, Jim. Would like to answer that one? Yeah, your sound's off, Jim. Need to put your sound on.
There we go. Hi, Julie. So the pens are £200 each, but you can get a 30-day free trial on the pen. So that gives you time to test it, see if it is suitable for that student. And if you purchase 5 or more, you get a 5% discount. And you can also get a class pack of our pens, which is basically 10 pens in a case with all of the cables and the headphones as well. But please feel free to email me directly. So I'll pop my email later on.
Okay. Caroline Ritson, for SEMH students, what evidence is needed to give the extra time? Is it an official letter from CAM stating the difficulties, Caroline?
Right, well, you'd need two things there. It depends. We're talking specifically about the 25% extra time. You would need to have the detailed file note, which I ran through with the 2 points there, plus the evidence of the disability. So a letter from CAMS, as I mentioned, would be sufficient. The letter from the specialist stating the disability doesn't have to say anything about access arrangements. In fact, it's probably better if it doesn't, because you wouldn't expect those specialists to be keeping themselves up to date about access arrangements. All we want from them is evidence that the student is genuinely disabled, and then that's backed up by the detailed file note, which I mentioned.
Then another one for us, Nikki Lloyd's asking, can you tell us which exams the pens are not allowed in? They are allowed in all exams. As Caroline mentioned, it has to be the student's normal way of working. So as long as they're using them day to day, it is the normal way of working. They can take them into any exam.
That's including English reading, guys.
Yeah, where the human
in your
reader.
modern foreign languages as well. So the pen can be used across all exams.
Karen's asking, where can we get copies of Hands Out 1 or 3 so we can use them in school?
If you become a member, those handouts are available on the members section of our website.
Okay.
In Word, so that you can type into them and put your headed paper on it, etc.
Okay, maybe one for you, Jim, if you're aware. I'm trying to move towards more electronic resources. We already use reader pens, but I'm wondering if there is a suggested text-to-speak and electronic reader software. That's from Suzanne Henderson.
Lina might be better at that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The 2 main ones that I keep hearing about are from Text Help and Claro Read. There are some fairly basic ones in Word, but I think you kind of get what you pay for, really. So they can be. I do hear that they can be a bit clunky, and it's probably worth actually paying for, one that's had more research and more money put into its development. So those are the 2 main ones that I keep hearing about.
Okay, and for the English literature paper, can a human reader read the text out for the students?
Yes, they can.
Yeah. Okay.
Because the key there is that the focus of the assessment isn't reading; it's understanding. It's thinking, about the content and the implications, all that kind of thing. But for English, what old-fashionedly I call English language, the focus of that, one of the key assessment criteria is you have to get the words off the page into your head independently. That's the key. And of course, if you're using a reading pen or a computer reader, you are doing that independently. That's the key there.
Yeah. Another question, who can be an assessor within a secondary school setting? We have our assessments conducted externally by EPs.
Right, okay, you have to be very careful if you're using external assessors. The JCQ are not really very keen on that. You must make sure that before the assessor carries out the assessment, you've completed part 1. It's called part A a couple of years ago. I'm getting out of date there. So part 1 of Form 8, that must be completed with the history of difficulties and the support the student gets in the centre. That must be sent to the external assessor before the assessment is carried out. If it's done the other way around, if a parent commissions an assessment and then sends that into school, you can't accept it. I mean, by all means, read it through and see whether there's something there that would prompt you to do an assessment, but you can't use that as evidence. So to be a qualified assessor, you need a level 7, a master's level qualification in assessment. And there's a number of qualifications that meet this criteria. So I've got an OCR level 7 diploma, which qualifies me to assess and teach students with learning difficulties. But there are a couple of courses actually on the market now, which are specifically just about access arrangements. So I mentioned our PAPA, Postgraduate Award of Proficiency in Assessment for Access Arrangements. That's about probably just over 100 hours. And there are a couple of other qualifications as well, which if you're a teacher, you can do those, and that will qualify you to carry out assessments.
Okay, next question from Alison. Is it better for a student to use a normal scanning pen, so i.e. the reader pen, as a normal way of working, or exam pens?
Good question. So I guess the problem with using the ordinary exam pen is you've got to buy 2 of them. So you buy the normal one that's got the data storage and the dictionary and thesaurus on, and then you have to have a separate one for exams. So I guess there's a bit of a jump there for the student as well, who's perhaps used to using the thesaurus, and they can't just in an exam, plus the extra expense. I don't know what you find, Jim. Are most people using just the exam pen?
It's a bit of both, really. It depends how they want the student to use it. Most students will have the exam pen, and then some students will have the reader pen, where it just helps them with everyday learning. So they won't just use it in specific classrooms, but they'd use it across a broad range of lessons.
Yeah.
So it's really helping them improve and giving them that kind of love for reading as well, so they can actually access the curriculum. And it's great to have the dictionary as well. So it all depends on the student and the school, really.
And I'd say in colleges, most institutions are very much invested in the exam reader. But this year, I've seen sort of a shift in turn, really. We're getting a lot of English departments now investing in the reader pen, because obviously it's got the dictionary on there, etc., especially for those students that are transitioning through from secondary school. They're not hitting the grades on their English and maths. So I think that's where the reader pen comes into play. It's absolutely perfect. And I think with this pandemic that we've got at the moment, again, I'm seeing a lot of FE colleges investing in the reader pens to support those students that are studying remotely. And
same here.
Most colleges are running lectures on site for just a few hours a week. So the students that are studying remotely in the FE and higher ed sector do not have that support or access to that support that they may have on campus. So again, I think this is where we're seeing more institutions actually now starting to look at the reader pen. But predominantly, historically, should I say, it's very much, if it's to be used in exams, they've gone down the exam reader route. And of course, it's all down to budgets as well and costs, etc. Okay. For MFL, can they use a reading pen if they normally have a reader?
In the reading papers, yes. It's really the same as English language. That they can have the reading pen there. It's the same for modern foreign languages, where the focus of the assessment is reading. You couldn't have a human reader, but you could have a computer reader or the reading pen.
Okay, quite a few questions to run through here. So Louise Smith, can you advise on reading comprehension speed assessments, please, Caroline? Yes,
there's the exact, it used to be Lucid, it's now GL assessment. That's an electronic test that you do online. And the DRA, the Diagnostic Reading Analysis 3, is a HODA assessment that has reading comprehension speed as well.
Okay, Sarah, I think you've got issues with some of your pens. You can
I'll get in touch with Sarah.
Myself or Jim, that's fine. For EHCP pupils, is it a short file note or a long one they need?
For what?
Yes, for what?
The short file note for a reader or computer reader. It's a detailed file note, the JCQ call it, for extra time up to 25%.
Okay. So would an ASD diagnosis be used as a diagnosis for extra time, even if cognitive tests do not show a weakness?
Well, the key there is the normal way of working. So you wouldn't need to do any standardised testing. I'm not quite sure why you would do them unless it's just for checking up progress, etc. in the centre. So you wouldn't need to do any standardised assessments. But if it's the normal way of working, if your teachers are saying this student runs out of time, yes, little side thing there is that actually asking your teachers, does so-and-so use extra time in class? The answer will always be no, because you know the bell goes and they go on to the next lesson. You can't have extra time in class. What you need to be asking your teachers is, does this student run out of time? And if the teacher is saying, yes, this student doesn't get as much done in class as other students, and if they're conscientious, perhaps they're taking work home to complete, whereas most other students aren't, that's the key there. It's nothing to do with standard scores. So you've got the diagnosis of ASD, and the key there is what you can put in the detailed file note where the teachers are saying this student needs extra time. Nothing to do with standard scores.
Okay, not sure if we covered this one already. Patricia's asking, can you please comment on the need for evidence of EAAs as a normal way of working?
That's quite a long question, because it depends on the arrangement, really. As I mentioned, for a reader, we think that probably readers can be quite hidden arrangements. It may be that a student sits next to someone who reads everything. It could be that the teacher reads everything to the whole class. It could be that a more able peer sits next to the student. But I'd have to say different things for extra time and scribe, etc. We do actually have a document where we've summarised what the AARA says about normal way of working. So if you email my colleague Debbie at admin@CommunicateEd and ask for the normal way of working document, then we can get that over to you.
Okay, a few asking a similar question. So from Gay, does a file note have to be completed for a reader if a Form 8 has been completed for extra time? and there is already evidence for a reader in section A.
Yes, I'm afraid you have to do two separate things there. But as you saw, the short, concise file note for a reader is just a few sentences, but you wouldn't need to have a Form 8 for the extra time and the file note for the reader.
Okay, lots of questions. I think we're nearly coming to the end of them, Caroline, so I hope you're okay for time. So Cathy O'Donnell, is it 50% extra time across the whole English language paper or just the reading section?
No, just the reading section. So if there's 50 marks, so let's say there's 50% of the marks for reading and 50% of the marks for writing, you would just add the 50% to the 50% extra time to the half. So sorry, let me start that again. Say the paper's 2 hours and 50% of the marks go to reading and 50% of the marks to writing. So 1 hour of that paper is allocated to reading. So you would just add the 50% to that. So you just add 30 minutes to that paper. It's not the whole paper. It doesn't apply to the writing bit.
Excellent. Thanks, Caroline. Can ESOL students use reading pens? Yes.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Another question, how do we become a member? Again, I think this has been covered actually.
Okay, just a reminder, if you email admin, either go onto our website and click on membership at the top, or if you want free, which I'm sure you all will, free access for the first year, email Debbie, admin@communicateed.org.uk, and ask her for the link to get the free membership for the first year.
Okay. Yeah, Fiona, you've got the white reader pens, which do have an exam lock on them. You cannot use these in an exam. JCQ are very clear that...
I just saw that one, yeah. You can't use them in exams at all. That's so basically JCQ wanted us to create a new pen, and that's why 4 years ago we came up with the exam pen with the bright orange. So no, the reader pen cannot be used in examinations. It has to be the exam reader, which is locked down, and they can't access any of the features.
The key there, of course, is that the invigilator can then easily see if it's an exam. And invigilators can't go around and keep checking. They think, oh, you've got a white pen, right? I want to see it to see if it's locked down. That's why it's got to be orange, so it's really clear to the invigilator that it's the genuine exam pen.
Yes, 1 year warranty on pens. Jim, you've answered that. Lots of thank yous coming through, Caroline. Very informative.
Thank you.
Right, another question from Cathy O'Donnell. If a student has been assessed as qualifying for a reader, extra time and a word processor, but they don't make use of it in exams, should it be withdrawn? Just because they are deemed to need it doesn't mean they want it.
Right. This is a lot of discussion around this one. The regulations tell us that if a student doesn't use an arrangement in the exam, it's not the normal way of working, and it should be withdrawn. But there are some issues with that. So we know, for example, particularly with rest breaks and extra time, that sometimes students qualify for them. Teachers are saying that they work slowly or they need a break, but they don't actually use them in exams. And then some research shows that when you talk to them, what you find is, well, I knew I could have a break, so it meant it calmed me down, so I didn't need it. I've heard that, I don't know how many times, a student who was allowed a rest break, well, I didn't need it because I knew if I needed it, I could have one. Whereas if I knew I couldn't have a break, I'd have got in a panic and then I'd have needed a break, if you see what I mean. And really similar with extra time. So just the regulations do say that if a student doesn't use an arrangement, it shouldn't be allowed, but just be very careful. After putting that new statement in, they did say as long as it won't lead to the student having a disadvantage. So just be a little bit careful about taking away arrangements that the student does genuinely qualify for.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. Question from Justine. Can you clarify what evidence is required internally to show a student's normal way of working with an exam access arrangement of 25%?
I think I'm going to just point you to that handout that I mentioned, the normal way of working handout. It's too big a question to try and answer here.
Again, Ellen, we've covered this. You've got the reader pens logged in exam mode. Is that okay? No, it's not okay. It just has to be the orange exam reader pen. Jim, you've
I've
answered
responded to
Leanne's,
the rest of them. Yeah.
Okay, I think
we'll let Caroline go.
yeah,
That's right.
yeah. Well, just one last question, Caroline,
Okay.
and then we'll close. So this is from Louise Smith. If the exam is 2 hours, 1 hour writing and 1 hour reading, no application for extra time, would only 15 minutes be added? So it's a 2 hour
I'm not
exam.
quite sure what you mean. Sorry.
No.
Do you mean working in the English paper without the human reader?
She's not clear. I think we can get in touch with Louise about that.
Yeah.
Louise said yes.
Yeah.
Louise said yes.
Oh, she's saying yes.
Yeah,
okay.
She said yes.
So as I explained earlier, you don't have to apply for the 50% extra time if you're not having a human reader. In the application approved notice, there's a section there which explains that if the student would normally have a human reader, but they're not using it in a paper assessing reading because they're not allowed to, as long as they're not using a computer reader or the reading pen, they can have 50% extra time. You don't need to have applied for 50% extra time to get that. It just kind of goes hand in hand with having permission for a reader. So in the example I gave earlier, you would be able to give the student an extra 30 minutes in a 2 hour paper.
Okay, so I think we're going to close now. Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you
My pleasure.
to everyone that's attended, both from within the UK and internationally. We've got fabulous feedback, Caroline, so that's been really interesting.
Thank you very much.
Very informative.
Can I just chip in one little thing?
Yeah.
We know that there are lots of questions out there about access arrangements. I could spend my entire week, and my colleague as well, just answering access arrangements questions. So if you go to our website, www.communicateed.org.uk, in the top left-hand corner, there's a little button there which shows you we've got all sorts of ways that you can ask questions. And some of them cost money because it takes a lot of our time. We've got mentoring, we've got forums, etc. All sorts of ways that you can get your questions answered. So please, if you do have questions, can I just ask you to click on that button, and hopefully you'll find something there that will meet your needs so that we can answer your questions. Thank you.
And Lynn Dixon saying really useful. Can't recommend being a member of Communicate Ed highly enough. So
bless you.
Do visit the website, guys.
Yeah,
do visit the website and look into the membership.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we'll end that there. Lina, thanks again for coming on and taking the time to do this webinar. It's been fantastic. I've even learnt some personally myself as well about exams. It's been fantastic to hear. Because I didn't know some of the stuff that's available to students. So it's great to hear personally anyway. So fantastic. So
thank you.
Again, thank you so
pleasure.
much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.